For decades, American power has rested on a familiar idea. When the United States enters a war, the balance changes. Carrier groups move, stealth aircraft fly, missiles strike, and the battlefield is expected to bend under pressure. In purely military terms, that expectation still has weight. U.S. Central Command says Operation Epic Fury began on February 28, 2026, and by mid-March had already involved thousands of combat flights and strikes on more than 7,000 targets. On paper, that still looks like overwhelming force, but wars are not decided by force alone. They are also decided by endurance, by uncertainty, and by the ability to make every additional day of fighting feel more expensive than the last. And that is where a war with Iran becomes dangerous. Iran does not need to defeat the United States in a clean, conventional contest. It does not need to destroy American power. It only needs to make the cost of using that power rise steadily, militarily, politically, and economically, until quick victory stops looking realistic and continued escalation stops looking simple. That is why this conflict now matters far beyond Iran itself, because the center of gravity is no longer only the battlefield. It is also the Strait of Hormuz. In 2024, around 20 million barrels of oil per day moved through the strait, equal to about 20% of global petroleum liquids consumption. The U.S. Energy Information Administration says very few practical alternatives exist if those flows are seriously disrupted, and around 1/5 of global LNG trade also transited Hormuz in 2024. This is not just a narrow waterway. It is one of the world's most sensitive pressure points. And once war touches Hormuz, it stops being only a military story. It becomes an energy story, a shipping story, an inflation story, and a political stability story. The International Energy Agency says the current conflict has triggered the largest supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. On March 11th, these member countries agreed to release 400 million barrels from emergency reserves, the largest coordinated oil stock release in the agency's history, because flows through Hormuz had fallen to less than 10% of pre-conflict levels. Even that stock release is only a buffer. The EEA has been clear that the real solution is the resumption of regular shipping through the strait. This is the logic many people still miss. They imagine the war as a simple comparison between the stronger military and the weaker one. But that is not how this theater works. The real contest is about system stress. Cheap and repeatable pressure on one side can force expensive and continuous defense on the other. Defense analysts have warned that Iran's use of drones and missiles is dangerous not only because of what gets hit, but because every wave forces more interceptions, more deployments, more alert status, and more strain on already stretched defense networks. In this kind of war, it is possible to remain stronger overall and still become strategically uncomfortable. That is also why the diplomatic picture matters almost as much as the military one. The Trump administration has offered a 15-point ceasefire plan to Iran through Pakistani intermediaries, even while moving additional troops and marine units into the region. Iran has publicly denied that talks are underway. That contradiction tells us something important. The war is continuing, but Washington is already looking for a way to shape an exit, or at least a pause, before the conflict becomes even harder to manage. This is not proof of defeat. It is proof that military dominance does not automatically produce strategic clarity. The wider world sees the same danger, even if it cannot agree on the answer. European leaders have called for the reopening of Hormuz and for attacks on energy and water infrastructure to stop, but they have shown little appetite for direct military escalation. At the United Nations, Bahrain pushed a draft resolution calling for all necessary means to keep the strait open, while China and Russia opposed that language, and France circulated a softer alternative focused on diplomacy and de-escalation. So the world is not united around how to end this crisis. It is only united around one fact: Hormuz cannot remain disrupted without consequences spreading everywhere. And those consequences are not evenly distributed. The EIA estimates that 84% of the crude oil and condensate and 83% of the LNG that moved through Hormuz in 2024 went to Asian markets, with China, India, Japan, and South Korea accounting for the largest shares. That means the economic shock of a prolonged crisis in Hormuz lands especially hard on Asia first, on energy-importing economies, on freight costs, on power systems, on industrial supply chains, and eventually on household budgets. A missile in the Gulf can become a price shock thousands of miles away. That is what makes this war so globally dangerous. If current signals hold, the most likely next phase is not full peace, but a slower and more negotiated war. Not an end to pressure, but a partial cooling of tempo. The diplomacy now underway, the delayed strikes on certain infrastructure targets, and the international push to reopen Hormuz all suggest that the near-term objective may be to create a pause without solving the underlying conflict. In other words, a phase in which all sides keep leverage, keep options open, and keep preparing for both talks and renewed escalation at the same time. That is an inference based on current developments, not a confirmed outcome. A second likely development is a stronger international effort to secure shipping through some form of protected corridor or safe passage mechanism. The IEA has said that adequate insurance mechanisms and physical protection for shipping are essential to restoring flows, and the IMO has called for a safe passage framework to move merchant vessels out of danger. If diplomacy stalls, pressure will rise for convoy-style protection, more maritime coordination, and possibly a broader multinational security role in and around Hormuz. That, too, remains a forward-looking assessment, but it is grounded in the direction the crisis is already moving. And beyond the immediate crisis, this war is likely to leave a deeper legacy. It will accelerate the search for energy routes that do not depend so heavily on Hormuz. It will push militaries to invest more seriously in cheaper counter-drone and layered air defense solutions. And it will remind governments that the most dangerous wars are not always the ones where the stronger side risks losing outright. Sometimes the most dangerous wars are the ones where the stronger side can keep fighting, keep spending, keep deploying, and still discover that control is slipping away, one cautious decision at a time. So the real question is no longer whether the United States can continue this war. It can. The real question is whether the United States, its allies, and the global economy can continue paying the price of fighting in the same way, for the same goals, under the same assumptions. Because this conflict is no longer only about destruction. It is about endurance. It is about choke points. It is about pressure. And it is about whether the modern world can keep its balance when one narrow stretch of water becomes the hinge on which everything else begins to move.